Why is Florida so important in this race?
Well, I think it's a big state. So New York and Texas and California are the top three, and then you've got Florida. So it's just worth a lot of points in the electoral college system that they've got. And then the other issue is that those other three big states tend to not swing. California is always blue, New York is always blue, Texas is usually always red, maybe not this time round, but usually, whereas Florida, it flip-flops between blue and red. And that's basically the reason why it's so important.
So we've been looking at the polls, and CNN currently is putting Biden on 50% to 47% for Trump. How much can we trust these polls?
Well, I think that the idea that the polls aren't trustworthy is a bit overstated. So if you look at the last election, the polls suggested Clinton would win the national vote by about 2 points, and that's what she won the national vote by. The difficulty is to kind of get the state polls and the national polls to kind of fit together. And there's also a large margin of error. So with any poll you get or you read or you see, you have to always assume that there's a 5-point margin of error. So if the polls say Biden's ahead by 3 or 4 points, that's actually not enough for you to be certain that Biden is going to win. I mean, if he's 4 points ahead, that means 8 times out of 10, roughly, he would win that state, but 2 times out of 10, he'd lose it. So I think the polls are good, but there's a large margin of error, and so you're looking at a whole bunch of states that are still toss-ups at this point. Now, what's, I think, unfortunate for Mr. Trump is that Texas is one of those states that's in the toss-up zone. And that's not really a good sign for him. But you can see he could potentially win Texas, Iowa, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. And they're nearly all with less than a 5% poll lead for Joe Biden. And that would include Florida. Pennsylvania is just more than 5 points, but only just. And so if there is a pathway for Trump, that would be it. And obviously he has to win Florida. It's a must-win state for him. Without that, he can't get to his 270 electoral college votes or whatever they need to win the election there. And I think the other thing to say is that Florida is going to be really important because I don't know if you remember the 2000 election when we had the hanging chads in Florida and it went on for days and days and days, and then the Supreme Court had to make rulings on it. But Florida's actually really improved the way it counts votes. And it's also one of the few states that will count the postal votes already, so that on the night of the election, Florida will probably be one of the first states for the result to come in. Plus, it's a key swing state. So I think if Biden or Trump win Florida on the night, then I think that tells you a lot about how the election's going to go.
And just how much of a factor do you think COVID is?
I think that depends on who you ask. I think what the polls are kind of showing is that in the Midwest, which is states like Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, that Trump won last time but probably won't win this time. Part of the reason he's losing all those states is because of they're really badly hit by the COVID-19. And Pennsylvania's not too similar to those states in that regard. And that's why Pennsylvania is still on the cards for Trump to kind of scrape in here. In Florida particularly, you've got Florida's a strange kind of state because what they say is the further north you go in Florida, the further south you get. So the north of Florida is like old South, Kentucky, Louisiana. It's got a lot of Republican voters, whereas the very south of Florida with all the retirees, a lot of Democrat voters. And then, of course, you've got the Latin American community there. And so it's very hard for Biden or Trump to pitch to Florida and hit all those three big key constituencies at the same time. And then what happened last time, of course, was that the northern white conservative voters came out in much greater numbers than had been predicted by the polls, and that's why Trump won in Florida. So the question is, can Biden increase the turnout amongst black voters or Latino voters? Well, we don't know, obviously.
We have seen today Biden releasing a Spanish language kind of campaign video. I mean, just how much do you think that will appeal to those voters?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, they do appreciate it when people speak Spanish, if that's like their core language. But that's obviously what we know is this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to hit that Latino vote, which in the past has swung elections in Florida, where Florida was the key state. I think you can go all the way back to Carter. Carter won Florida in 76. Reagan won it in 80. I think the only U.S. president who lost Florida and won the election, or the other way around, he won Florida and lost the election, was George Herbert Walker Bush, who won Florida but lost to Clinton in, must have been 1994. Are my years correct? I think they are. 1992. And so winning Florida is absolutely critical. And in the 2000 election, which was George W. Bush versus Al Gore, the Cuban Americans voted for Bush over Gore, partly because there was a huge incident with some Cuban immigrants who'd washed up on the shore, and the little boy's mother died. And Clinton and Gore, who were then in charge, they decided to send the boy back to Cuba because his father was still alive there. But the Cuban Floridans felt that the boy should have stayed in America. And I think this kind of stuff tips the election towards George W. Bush, who ultimately wins because he wins in Florida. So you can't take chances on the Floridan Latino vote if you're Joe Biden, I think. You've just got to do everything you can. Because if you can win Florida, it's all over for Trump. But if you lose Florida, Biden has plenty of other paths to win the presidency, which Trump doesn't have.
So who are you calling it then?
Am I calling it?
Yeah.
No. No, I think there is still a scenario in which Trump wins.